Welcome to this week's episode of the Refold Roundtable Podcast, where we talk about things that you want us to talk about. And in this week's episode, we are talking about the very controversial subject of early outputting. How dangerous is it? Is it a sin? Will it really damage your ability to output later on? We have people in the panel with all different opinions on this, and we would love to hear what you have to say as well in the comments. So, welcome to this week's episode.
Dun dun dun.
Dun dun dun.
Right, so early output. I guess let's start off with the roadmap. Does anyone actually know when the Refold roadmap recommends output? I think it's stage 3, right? They recommend stage 3. Writing
3.
output is what comes first, right?
Yeah, 3A.
I believe so. Yes.
Okay, and is that controversial? Does anybody agree that you should wait until you have like high level comprehension of a slice of life show?
I would say in my case, I didn't really output it early in the sense that I did like none and then just started outputting it like solid 2C. But I didn't really try and gain high mastery, at least not intentionally, in a particular dialect. It was more so like, can I comfortably understand the stuff that I generally watch, but not like, do I understand everything? Just can I comfortably, I mean, it was more so a mental thing for me as well, because it was more like, it got hard to not output, because like words and things kept popping up in my head through the day to day. So it kind of felt like, and I started feeling more like antsy, like ready to like start. So it was more of that sense where like it was hard not to output, and so once it got hard not to.
Being in Texas,
you also avoided
learning Spanish. You probably have a lot of opportunities to like speak Spanish, right?
Yes.
It's not like you're a weeb in Idaho who has no Japanese people around for miles, right? It's like a very real living language in your day-to-day.
Yeah, I live in like Dallas, so like DFW. So like at least in DFW, 40% of the county speaks Spanish like natively, or in their home is how they define that. So it's like, yeah, you run into, I mean, it's not like all over the place, mainly because like I'm like a black guy, so like no one expects me to speak Spanish, but
that's very much like a Texan thing, because when I was in New York, there are so many Dominicans who speak Spanish in New York City. So there, definitely are a lot of like black native Spanish speakers, but I can imagine in like Dallas, it's mostly like your typical, Mexican, Central American, diaspora.
I want to say, like, so out of the Spanish speaker, because I looked at all like we have a lot of data on this, and like the state of Texas like published a lot of stuff on that, and I think so 86% of the Spanish speakers in Dallas County is Mexican. And then the other 14% is like every other country. So, or not, nationality. Wow. So yeah, I have a friend. She is from El Salvador, and she gets tired of people calling her Mexican. She gets really annoyed by it, but she gets it, I guess.
Yeah.
That happens though. I live in Asia, and a lot of people will be like, "Oh, there's an American." I'm like, actually, he is from Belgium, not American.
I mean, they're kind of the same. They're like right in that kind of part of the hemisphere.
I don't know, but I can see why it would be annoying. But at the same time, it's just like it's sort of like a cultural thing. Like I think in Mexican Spanish, you hear chino a lot for like just any sort of East Asian person. So like it definitely goes both ways. Where like speakers of an in-group have like this sort of generic out-group term. Is it a good thing? I don't necessarily think it's a good thing, but it is a thing that we have to deal with, no matter where we are, no matter what language we're speaking.
Right.
Yeah, 100%.
Right.
Cool. And
so I think. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that Afro also. I remember talking with him before, and he also avoided. I think you said that you avoided reading in the beginning, right? Like you went so far as to focus mostly on listening, and you were aware of sub-vocalization in reading, and that was something that you wanted to avoid in the beginning, if I remember correctly.
Exactly.
So how long did you wait to start reading?
It wasn't too long. It was
Yeah.
like, I want to say, I could literally check my tracking sheet too, because I remember having to
I
add a
bet
new
you could.
column. I had to literally
I
add a
bet
new
you could.
reading column and like rewrite everything. I'm like, oh, screw it. I wasn't expecting reading, but like I didn't look at any words. I didn't look at any, like, I didn't want to look, because to me the Latin script, with Spanish, was kind of throwing me off with like pronunciation. And
Yeah, yeah.
especially because I learned Esperanto too, and it also has a Latin script. So I kept getting thrown off. So I was like, screw this. I'm not gonna look at anything. I'm not gonna look at how anything's spelled. I'm gonna just like listen to it, and kind of learn how to say it. So same thing with my teacher. I wouldn't, when I was, like, or when I was hearing anything, I would always try and just get the rough gist of what the word was. And I did that for about 4 months, I think. After about 4 months, I was like, okay, I'm tired of this. let's crack open a book. Let's see what's up, And then it was like a solid 2 weeks of me figuring out how everything was spelled, and I didn't know how Spanish was spelled, uh, if before, and it really, or at least I couldn't remember, at least. And so I remember it was like, oh, so that's how that's.
Yeah.
Oh wait, the H is silent. Okay, the H is silent. Got you. Oh wait,
Right.
that's a U and an I, but it's a I. Okay, anyway. But yeah, that was kind of. I was kind of confused for a little bit.
Nice.
Oh, the two L's is a Y. Okay, good to know.
This is one of the most interesting things about like language learning to me. Is a lot of people, Americans in particular, cannot fathom that like different languages use the same alphabet in different ways. They assign different values to the letter. Like the J sound in Spanish, something like a h or a th, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I've noticed it a lot. It's just really interesting to me because I wonder if it's just due to our like overall lower level of exposure to like foreign languages that do use the same script as us, or what. Just conjecture.
You see that everywhere though, right? That uses Latin alphabet. Like when you listen to people that speak Spanish try to say English words, they say it, with a very Spanish pronunciation. So
Mm-hmm.
I think like if you're just used to seeing it, you
But
don't know how to
is that
get it
necessarily
unless
like
you get it.
a spelling issue, or if they just don't have the ability to
I think
produce
it's
the right phonemes?
I think,
no, it's like full on
yeah,
It's
Spanishified
like
English words.
I
like
think,
Facebook, Cornplay. Like some of them are pretty nativized. At that point,
yeah,
we
Hmm.
nativize loan words too. Like in English, we almost never say words the French way, even if they come from French. Right? We say
yeah.
table. We don't
I
say
mean,
tap.
if you do, you're kind of a pretentious butthole. But I mean, I'm just saying.
Oh,
No,
one
but I
sec.
will
Glitch
say
just
this
raised
though.
his hand.
I will say this though. I think a lot of it has to do with, we've there's such a built-in automaticity with the association of like the letter A, right? So to me, when I see A, before I'm even aware of it, my brain is already like pronouncing it, or knows, how that word is. And the same thing happens
Hmm.
with a native Spanish speaker, right? When as soon as they see the letter A, they immediately process and internalize it through Spanish, and so they pronounce it, ah, versus I'll say A, they say ah, like, or whatever.
And you're
So
an
I think,
Yeah.
Esperantist, right? You like
yeah,
Esperanto. I have to
yeah.
say, I don't feel like it's part of the Refold spirit to like talk down on other languages. Esperanto has the world's ugliest orthography. The spelling is just not
I
pleasant.
mean,
Wow, shots fired.
I know shots fired. Nah, it's cool. But shots are fired. I'm not really offended, but I will say this: I equally thought Esperanto. Like, I thought, my main gripe when I started learning Esperanto was like, I mean, look, this language is kind of cool, but like, man, is it ugly? Like, that was
The
my
spelling is
first thought
really
process.
ugly.
So to me, I don't mind the spelling. It was more so the sound, pronouncing the janky spelling was like, oh. But then I kind of realized that, okay, some people kind of overcook it. A lot of Esperantists overcook it, and so it sounds way harsher than it is. But on top of that, I think no matter how ugly the language might sound to you, once you've spent 400 or 500 hours or whatever with it, you don't hear it the same way anymore anyway. So it's kind of like, you
Yeah.
hear meaning, you don't hear the jarring sounds of it. So after learning Esperanto, and remember how I thought it was ugly for so long, and then it's like, now it's like, to me it sounds beautiful now, but that's, I'm like brainwashed at this point, so you can't really trust my word, right?
And one sec, I'm gonna introduce. So Sin has just joined. Sin is stage 3 in Japanese. He's a Japanese server admin, and Glitch has joined. Glitch is an English as a second language teacher in Australia who probably has some strong opinions
Wow.
on early output as well. So welcome,
I
guys.
love strong opinions.
Hello. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, welcome.
Yeah.
I was thinking first, like, about what you were saying about, like, you were saying Americans can't tell that letters like, can have various different pronunciations, like the letter J, like a sound in Spanish. I don't know, like, I don't know if I fully agree with that. I think it's a slow process of, like, adapting to it, because, like, I'm just thinking, like, the Vietnamese soup is pho, right? Like, originally everyone was calling that pho, but then slowly this wave comes through of like, oh no, it's actually read like this. So I feel like there is this sort of awareness in English that
Yeah, Glitch, your
there are
audio
multiple readings.
is being kind of strange.
I think
Is
it's
it
quite
your way?
ironic that his name is Glitch.
Yeah, his name is
Yeah, I
Glitch
know.
and his audio is glitching.
It feels
Yeah.
fitting, honestly. It's fitting.
I mean, I think
I'd
I
actually like to go through and ask everybody really quick, since we have our panel here, what their opinions are on early output. Just really quickly. I can go first and we can go down the line. So for me personally, I am not an opponent of early output. I also am not a perfectionist. So personally, my goals are not to sound native like. I just want to sound educated and not like an idiot. So if I retain an accent and still have artifacts, that's not super detrimental to my goals. So personally, I don't really care about early outputting, but that's just me. Shiki, do you want to go next?
Generally, I don't really think it's a good idea until you've had a couple hundred hours at least of input so that you have some sort of idea how things are supposed to sound and you can kind of self-correct and you can realize, oh, I'm saying this horribly wrong, and you can fix yourself. And then later on, you can tweak it with more practice. I'm also somebody who's just hyper aware of accents in general. So if I can make myself sound better to my future listeners or conversation partners, that's something that's really important. So
Awesome. Gorg, you're next.
I am next. Okay, so what's the question again? My opinion on early output?
Yeah, like your personal opinion. Like, what's your hot take? What makes your view controversial? In a
I
couple
don't think
sentences?
early output is inherently a problem, assuming that you continue to immerse and study the language.
Yeah, definitely.
This
Agree with
idea of
that.
fossilization, I'm not sure that it's true. People, you see these snapshots like, oh, this person started learning English 5 years ago. Unless you go back, 5 years later, and then another 5 years, and you keep following up with them, you're not going to see how their accent changes. And maybe they just don't care. Maybe they're good enough, and they're fine with that. Frozen Rosen, who is our English pera pera, he's also quite good at Mandarin. His parents have been living in Germany for like 20 years, and they still sound South Asian, and that's okay. They don't care to improve further. So I definitely don't think perfection or near native accents are super important for some people. And yeah, it's a very complex issue. First off, does the person really care to sound native? Are they actually working towards it? And the second thing is, for fossilization to be proven as real, you would have to keep doing follow-up studies. And that's just not been done. The data isn't there. So right now I'm leaning towards not important, fossilization is not real, and no one has successfully proved to me that it is real.
Love that. Sin, what's your hot take?
You're talking, we can't hear you.
I'm in a very few words. I see. Nice.
Okay, well, Sin figures out his
How about
audio.
now?
Oh, good. Okay, good. Yep, we can hear you now. What's your hot take on early output?
I think it's gonna really depend on the person. I think more people are gonna be more suited, or I think certain people are gonna be more suited for an immersion kind of style of learning. More people are gonna be suited for, or rather, other people will be suited for early output specifically because maybe they're more extroverted. Also, I know people who basically got fluent in Japanese in a couple years and they were doing a whole bunch of early output. So I don't think it's as detrimental as people make it out to be. But I do think having a silent period before you actually start speaking will benefit you quite a bit. But again, I think it kind of depends a lot on the person. So
Nice. And Afro, we talked a lot about your outputting, but sum up your philosophy on output in like a couple of sentences, if you don't mind.
Can do. I would also say I'm kind of in Shiki's camp where I'm a bit sensitive to accents. So even when I'm speaking, I can like sometimes hear when my accent slips. So and it's not even something I'm paying attention to. It something just sounds off kind of thing. So in my camp, I like to have a. I don't really care to be native, but I want to be pretty good. You know what I mean? So that's just, and I also just have fun with that with accents. Like I like when referring to early output, I definitely think you need a silent parent. As Sin said, like I said, I'm a big proponent of I would recommend you output at 2C. Um, early output, but in the meantime or before then, don't do. You can parrot, you can repeat what natives say or things, but you can't really create new speech. I wouldn't recommend you create new speech. So that's kind of where my camp is on that.
Gotcha. And Glitch, what about you? What's your hot take?
Firstly, is my audio better now, or is it still?
It sounds better to me.
Okay.
Sounds better.
Sounds good.
All right. Okay. So I guess my thought is that, like, as was mentioned, I teach in a English language school, mostly for migrants and refugees. So they're forced to sort of output early, and I would say from my perspective, it definitely. I think I agree that language fossilization probably isn't real. I think our brains are more plastic than that, and over time you can correct your accent. But I think, in particular, it's like grammar structures and the way you use words, which might fossilize more than your actual accent. I think accent is more malleable and you can change that. But when it comes to like grammar structures, they can get set. And one risk about early output, which I see with my students, and I was mentioning in the conversation before, like the message chat, is that me as their teacher, I will adapt to their mistakes. So they always say like, "Oh, time's finished," when like a class is over or something, or "time's finished," but that's just not the way people speak. We say "time's up" or something like that. And so because they're saying "time's finished," and I'm hearing it all the time, I get used to that, and they're like, "Oh, is time's finished?" And I'm like, "Yeah, it's finished." Like I just agree. And so I'm ingraining their mistakes. So I think like if you do early output before you understand you're making mistakes, native speakers around you might affirm your mistakes as correct because they just get used to the way you speak. So I think that's one of the risks, I guess.
Now that's interesting about grammar being something you think is more fixed because actually, I've lived abroad for the past 7 years or so, and in my home dialect, we have double modals. So we say things like, "You might want to go to the store." I might could do that. You used to good, but now you can't. These things are totally grammatical in my dialect, but I don't use them often now because I very rarely speak to somebody from the South. And if they are from the South, they're usually from like an urban area and they speak something closer to general American. So I definitely feel like, at least within your native language, your grammar can adapt towards, the standard or to be less dialectal. A good example is like David Tennant. I think he speaks both Scottish and something closer to like standard English. But again, these are native languages. I'm not sure if that's relevant in like an L2 paradigm.
I think it's true. I think like you can adapt, and even as an L2, I think you could correct your grammar. But I think it's just like the sheer quantity of mistakes will be beyond things you can notice. I think it's sort of like what Matt said about persistent puzzles, and that not until the entire puzzle around it is in place can you even notice the mistake you're making. So you might be using like prepositions wrong for this one type of sentence, and you just never notice that because like you still don't have enough vocabulary or something like that.
With pluricentric languages like English, some things sound totally ungrammatical to me that would be grammatical to say you. Like in America, we don't say "how you gone," right? We say "how's it going." But you hear a lot of Australians say "how you going,"
How are you going?
which
Yeah.
sounds totally wrong to my American ears. So I wonder if being pluricentric has some sort of role in that, affirming other speakers' patterns.
I think it would be. I think it's only insofar as you actually hear the other dialects, because I hear American English all the time, so there's nothing that American English speakers use that sounds sort of strange to me. But obviously, not many Americans listen to Australians, except for now with like Bluey. But other than that, like there's not much like listening going on in the other direction. So I feel like, yeah, I probably say a lot of things you might sound a bit, they might sound jarring to you, but there's very little you could say that's jarring to me.
So if I count 8, 9, 10, that doesn't sound jarring.
What do you mean?
So I've got the pen merger. I've merged the short I, it, and before nasals. And believe it or not, a lot of Americans struggle to understand. So I find it interesting that as an Australian, you don't find it to be jarring.
You say 8, 9, 10?
8, 9, 10.
He says tin, like a tin can.
Tin, like
for
tin
10.
can.
Well, 8, 9,
10
10. Yeah, I just hear it as 10 when you say it.
Interesting.
Honestly, me too.
Yeah, if I'm being honest, I don't really hear the. I mean, I hear the difference, but like that's not something that I would like notice, especially between native speakers. It's kind of like whatever. If you're a native speaker, whatever you're saying is correct, unless you just you're speaking completely broken English, and that's just like another thing. But yeah,
this makes me think of something. It's kind of off topic, but this kind of shows how much context matters. Like a lot of times when you're learning your target language, people will kind of criticize you, like if you don't know the meaning of something, like totally out of context. Like context matters a lot. So in English, it's like what Afro was saying, our brain just auto corrects because we have the context that he's counting numbers. So we just hear it correctly, even if he says it like 10.
Yeah, I would agree with that. My husband likes to show me like Formula One stuff and he knows that I'm learning Spanish, and he'll just like throw up a random story in my face. He'd be like, "What's he saying?" And I'm like, "I have no idea. What's this even about? What's the context? What's going on here?" Yeah, pretty funny. So bringing it back to early output, there's also, I think, this misconception rather, that you're only ready to output once you can output perfectly. And that if you are outputting imperfectly, it means you haven't inputted enough and you should stop. What are y'all's thoughts on this? Personally, my personal opinion is that early, like bad output does not necessarily equal early output. I actually waited until I think stage 2C or 3A to start outputting, and my output is terrible.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that.
I am working. What?
I
that
think
my output is terrible.
Reached stage 3.
Thanks.
No. I'm not calling your Spanish bad. I'm saying that.
Listen, I can call myself terrible, but
when you first started outputting, people were like, "Oh no, Briz is doing early output," and you're like, "Well, technically, by the roadmap, I'm stage 3. This is normal output."
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I think that there's a stigma towards outputting wrong, and people should be aware that when you're stage 3, you're first starting to output. You're going to mix up cases, verb conjugations, word order. It doesn't mean you're early outputting per se because you've hit stage 3, right?
Yeah.
Is it wrong?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's wrong, but it's not early.
I also think that no matter when you start outputting, it's always going to be very rough. Like for the first like 100 hours of output, it's going to be very rough. There's no, whether you started at stage 3, stage 2C, or stage 7, it's always going to be rough just to get the, knock the, grease the wheel, so to speak. So it's kind of one of the things, like, to me, a good mark of outputting or when you want to output is when you can comfortably understand like your italki tutor. You know what I mean? Like that might be, or if you want to do an italki, or that would be like a great time to output, because when I started outputting with like italki, like the fact that I could understand, like comfortably understand my tutor, like no matter what we were talking about, made a huge difference in like my enjoyment of it, but too the fear and the trepidation of in starting it.
Yeah, I will say like my tutor. So like my output is not good. But my teacher has straight up told me and I don't think she's lying. Like she's very honest with me, and she's like, "You're literally the only student that I can talk normally to." So she doesn't dumb down. She might articulate more clearly, which I very much appreciate. But she just talks to me like a normal human being. And one of the things that I do is I pause after every sentence and I look at her with like anxiety, and I'm like, was that right? And she will tell me yes or no every single sentence. And sometimes I'll like start telling a story and like it starts out fine. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh my gosh, we are getting into the past. We're talking about possibilities. We're talking about like subjunctive stuff. I have no idea what's going on. And if I get it right, like at the very end, I'll look at her and I'll just like start like I'm literally out of breath because I'm so like, oh my gosh, how did I get it? And she's like, that was good for almost. And then she'll tell me, you know, like what it actually is. And then I'll repeat it to her. But you know, like I've kind of trained her to correct me almost every time I make a grammatical error because like I just look at her. Like I stop and I'm like, was that right? Was that right? Is this the right preposition? Like I'll say a phrase and if I'm not sure about the preposition, I'm like, is it they, in, guess? And she'll tell me.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I definitely agree with you, Afro, that like if you
Yeah.
can hear, if you can understand your teacher, I think that's a good time because
Yeah.
you can actually have a conversation.
So
Yeah,
I
yeah.
have a question here regarding the whole bad output, don't do it thing. What's up
Yeah.
with the stigma in Refold about outputting poorly or outputting early? Because I personally used to be one of those guys who wasn't afraid to go and output from day one. And then after joining Refold for the past 18 or 19 months, it's been like,
Right.
wow, I'm not good enough. I shouldn't,
Yeah.
output. Even with languages that I'm comfortable in. I'm a teacher on Dialects.com. I'm like very comfortable in the language. I had a period of like a month or two last year where I was like, I don't want to output. And
Yeah.
that's not something that's great when you live in the country, right? Where you actually have to
I was
speak.
gonna say, like you live in the Philippines, like you really have no choice.
So, what's up with it? Why is this like a Refold
So
phenomenon?
I think that's the Japanese learner's fault.
I mean,
Sorry.
I didn't want to point and say anything, but
I
It's
know
all Shiki's fault, all
it's
Sin's fault, all their
yeah.
fault. No, just playing.
It's the Japanese community's fault. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, I include myself in there, but I'm talking about it as like a separate thing. But it's like the Japanese community has a lot of people who have a perfectionist mindset, and they think that if they say one syllable wrong or if they use slightly wrong pitch accent, then they're doomed forever, and everyone's gonna laugh at them, like the end of the movie Carrie.
Speaking of pitch
Yeah.
accent, I had my first realization. I listened to a Korean ASM artist speaking in Japanese, and she had no pitch accent. And I was like, it finally dawned on me. This is what they mean. This is how Americans sound. Because otherwise, she seemed quite competent. The comments were all in Japanese. Korean is not so different structurally from Japanese. I'm sure she was quite okay, but it did stand out that she had no pitch accent, and that was the first time it really like I had that eureka moment. Like, wow, maybe pitch accent is important.
Wow. Welcome to the pitch accent side, I guess.
Yeah, I'm a turncoat.
It makes me think that for me, I think like, oh sorry, do you want to go or?
No, go ahead, Glitch.
Okay, so I was just thinking about this early output thing. I think for me, I don't think it's necessarily a problem, but I think there's two different spheres of what early output actually means, and we talk about them as the same thing, but they're actually different things. So I think the grammar and pronunciation are completely different processes, and early output or either type is sort of like a different situation. So like I've been thinking like with grammar, I think if you are constantly like if you either have a tutor who's really knowledgeable about grammar, or you're constantly reading about grammar in the sense of like as you output, you're reading grammar, you're checking that the way you're speaking is actually the way like thoughts are formed in that language correctly. I feel like you're always going to be adapting and modifying your way of speaking, and I think you can start doing that quite early on as long as you understand the grammatical terms. So you could probably output and not worry about your grammar so much as long as you are consistently learning about grammar. But when it comes to phonetics, that's a little bit harder because like with pitch, if you're coming from English, you don't have a system in your brain of sort of even changing the pitch of your words like arbitrarily. We only change the pitch like to indicate like questions and things like that, but we don't change word pitch in the same way that you might in like Chinese or Japanese. So it's sort of like a process that we're not used to, and reading about it early on doesn't really help us to understand how to do it properly. So I think that, yeah, when you're coming from the perspective of like accent, that's probably why it comes out of the Japanese community, because they know about this big pitch thing that's so difficult for an English or, European speaker from most European languages, right? It's so difficult for us because we just don't have that aspect. We have grammar. I think grammar is not as
Right.
difficult. But yeah, because the Japanese has that. And then with Mandarin, I guess you don't see the same issue or any Chinese dialect, because um, tones are like so well known. So I think people are a bit more like, yeah, Matt has a whole video about like why, or it was on Q&A about why tones are inherently not as hard as pitch accent. So yeah, I think that's probably why it seems like it's coming out of that community and within Refold. But yeah.
So with Japanese, there's regional variation in pitch, and among native Mandarin speakers, there's native variation in tone. So obviously, standard Taiwanese Mandarin and standard Chinese Mandarin have differences in tone. But within China itself, Mandarin is spoken over a huge like geographic area, and it's actually quite diverse. My question is, if we had like an advanced Chinese speaker L2, how does that affect your comprehension when the tonal system is different? I think like Northeastern Mandarin might have 5 or 6 tones. Standard Mandarin has 4. And then between the two varieties of Standard Mandarin, mainland and then Taiwan, you've got variation. I wonder how that would affect their comprehension.
Have you talked with any of the Chinese learners? Because I like to stalk around in their forum for, I just like going to different Refold servers, and I've asked them a similar question. And I was asking them about writing. I was like, hey, so because I'm like, okay, what if I hypothetically wanted to learn Chinese next? And I get into writing and all that, and they were like, oh, writing's the easy part. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, reading and writing is like, isn't that supposed to be like, Chinese characters? Isn't that supposed to be the hardest part? It's like, no, the hardest part is comprehension. I'm like, wait, what? And so they were talking, and they were explaining like the huge dialectal differentiation between the different dialects and especially when you throw in tones and the slight word. He's like, yeah. So they were literally saying that reading and writing is actually the easiest part of Chinese. The actually getting your comprehension where you can understand most, billion plus native speakers comfortably is the difficult part.
I think of it as
Wow.
similar with like Mandarin, as similar to English in the sense that like, I guess it's all about the exposure you have to those different varieties. So like if you hear a variety that has 6 tones, or like you hear Taiwanese and mainland, like Northern Mandarin, or Shanghai, or wherever the region is that you're listening to, right? If you hear these varieties all the time, you get used to them, you understand how to comprehend them. So it's sort of like you get used to the way that people speak. The same as like, growing up in Australia, I got very used to American speech just because like 80% of television comes from there. So like, I get used to the way you speak and the dialects in America, but like it doesn't necessarily happen in reverse. So I sort of think it's like a similar thing like that. It's all just about like exposure to those variations.
Interesting. I think it's exposure.
I see that. That makes total sense to me.
Because the core of the vocab is mostly the same. Like, sure, maybe you say trash can and we say rubbish bin, right? But like, there's the core of the vocab will be the same across different dialects, but and the grammar will be very similar as well. I know
And
there's
to clarify,
variations
by
in grammar,
dialects,
but
you mean varieties of Mandarin specifically.
varieties of specifically Mandarin or English. Yeah, I'm just talking about both. Yeah, I don't mean like Cantonese.
Speaking of Cantonese, I see that Hulk is in the audience. A Pinghua TikTok showed up in my Reddit feed. I almost sent it to you, Hulk. I'm curious what your comprehension would be of Pinghua, since I guess it's a Yue variety of Chinese, but it's not anything close to standard Cantonese.
One thing about I wanted to touch on was what Cheeky brought up about the whole fear of output and things like that. I do think it's a byproduct of like the whole AJAT and the whole, the kind of roots of how Refold was founded. But I also think it has a lot to do with the large disparity that starts to be created between your comprehension and your output, and it seems more and more daunting. The better you get at comprehension, I think it
Yes.
has something to do with that too. Because
Yeah.
when I learned Esperanto, like I was speaking for, the polyglot of choice that I follow was Benny Lewis and Moses McCormick. So like I was just speaking gibberish all day, and there was also problems with that. But like I was very confident and very putting myself out there when it came to output. And it's just very shocking to me seeing how like timid I am when it comes to Spanish now, even though like literally just 2 years ago I was just like tackling people to try and speak Esperanto with them, and now I'm like running from Spanish speakers kind of thing. So it's kind of I do feel like the difference between my comprehension and my general output ability has played a large role in that, in the trepidation that I've come across.
Yeah, it's kind of like a tricky balance. It's kind of like if you're musically trained and you know when something is out of tune. It's like you can't unhear it. So it's like whenever you've got enough input to where you feel like you could say something and output, then you can't help but hear your mistakes. So it makes you not want to do it, like even less.
Yeah.
Or even more, rather.
I will say outputting to me is definitely painful, even though I'm not like I'm not like opposed to early outputting, quote unquote early outputting. Despite having waited a long time myself, like when I output, it's just like you said, like I know that it's not right. A lot of times I couldn't tell you why it's not right, but I'm like, this is not something that I've read or heard before, and this is awful.
It's also
and it's like, yeah.
Sorry. It's also like
No.
the
you go. Your turn. You go.
It's also it's also like the curse of like being an adult and being like socially embarrassed. Like kids and babies just don't care. They'll like say whatever
anxiety.
they want. Yeah.
Yeah.
What Briz just said reminds me of what Matt once
too.
said. That language is not a creative process. And I'm not sure how much I agree with that, but it sounds like you've definitely been influenced by that line of thought, Brie.
Probably. I mean, I've watched all of his videos.
This could be its own thing. L2 speaker identity and their second language could be a whole other topic for a podcast.
More like grammar, not necessarily like phrasing. I could care less. Like honestly, like I'm probably the worst refolder ever because I really care about, can I be understood? Do I sound like an idiot? I don't care if I can be marked as a gringa like 100 million miles away. I'm fine with that. I just don't want to sound stupid. That is my driving goal, is just not sound like
Refold,
an idiot.
and we have like a lot of people buying from Latin America, or they just want to learn how to learn English. And my Spanish is like, I'm sure, way worse than anybody else here who speaks Spanish. And I often feel like I sound like a moron, or I sound like a little bit short or rude. That's one of my biggest fears, because like I don't know how to be super polite.
See, add smiley faces to everything.
In my case, I don't really care about seeming stupid, like, because to me that's more reasons that adds to your like comedic charm or whatever. You sound, because everyone loves like Jackie Chan, right? He speaks broken English, but everybody loves Jackie Chan. He's funny as hell. But like in my case, the thing that drives me is the frustration of not being able to say what I want to say. I don't care if I sound like an idiot. That to me,
I think
is
that's what I mean. I want to be understood. I want to be understood. Like not, and I do want to use correct grammar. It is not something I'm good at, but like I would like to sound like someone who is educated. And we were talking about this earlier, like this whole like stigma thing. I think a lot of it might come to the fact that immersion learning, though now it's kind of gotten more popular. There's a lot of different products and people advocating for immersion learning, but it hasn't always been that way. Only just recently, I feel like immersion learning has really started like taking off, if you will. And I almost feel like as an immersion learner, like personally, and maybe as a group, like we have something that we feel like we have to prove, like, oh no, this works better. Look how much better, we can be because like we're doing this method or whatever. And it's not like this superiority thing. It's just like you invest so much time into a method, into learning something, you want that validation that you made the right choice. And I think that, quote unquote, perfect output is some validation of making the right choice. But along the line, the ability to accept like different goals, different levels of comfortability. Wow, I can't even English, but different levels of acceptance of imperfections that are totally fine, because like you can have a different goal. Like me and you, we have different goals, but that doesn't make either one of us right or wrong. You know what I mean? Like your goal is your goal.
I
It's
also think
subjective.
I think it's also a natural product for immersion learning to make its mark. You've needed people that with like crazy good like abilities or like crazy stories, right? Like the prominent immersion learners. So that kind of puts pressure on like the rest of us chaps, like the average, the typical bunch of like, oh God, because that's what's getting put out there. People who've like, oh, I passed N1 in like in 10 months. Easy. Hashtag easy, like kind of
Jazzy
thing.
did it in 8.5 months. What a legend.
I love
You know what I'm
that.
saying?
That's amazing.
That's dope, but it also like terrifies
He
the
was
rest of
also
us.
spending 6 hours a day immersing. And that's a lot of time.
That is a lot of time.
Wow. That's
Yeah,
really impressive.
not everybody can do 6 hours a day. Like that's about as much free time I would have on an like totally ideal day once in a blue moon. Because I've got work.
That's how much free time I have like on a
like,
weekend.
Go do errands.
Look, I have 6 hours a day to burn just from like my product. I'm still not trying to spend it all on Spanish. I love Spanish. I ain't doing that. Like I'm all right. I got other hobbies. I got other things I want to do,
I think 2 hours a day is definitely what we recommend internally, but even that's like a big obligation from your average show. Like if you've got other hobbies, you want to go rock climbing, you want to go on dates. I mean,
if you have a kid.
Kid just come and kid enters chat.
Hulk is not on mic, which is fine. I don't think he has a real mic. But he is a believer that you can get really good if you do 30 minutes a day every day for like the rest of your life. Like Hulk got to like 5,000 known words in Canto, spending half an hour a day, I think, over a year.
Wow. Hulk has a mic. Look, he's got the rage face.
You have like an actual proper mic, isn't it? Just like you talking into
here.
like a headset, like holding it up, like an inline mic. Because that's not a mic.
I don't have a mic. I'm just like living my best micless life. Worse, he has a webcam mic.
No, sorry, I'm not gonna give you the mic.
What? I just using my computer.
F's in the chat. F's in the chat for Hulk's mic.
I've seen Hulk in video. He's like holding up the inline mic on his Apple headphones.
I love that. Hulk. That makes me plus
Lo-fi.
5 respect for me. I love it. No F's. How?
For perfect output, you need perfect microphone. I've been trying not to laugh at these comments in the chat this whole time. Y'all guys are hilarious.
Fine. Laugh at them. Engage. So
I love it.
Afro, when we first started this podcast, it was like just me and Grizz, and we were able to engage more with the listeners. Now that we have a full panel, it's hard to give everybody airtime, and then also, I don't know, we're gonna have to work out a balance for like engaging with people. Totally engage.
We can create a questions chat, like where people actually want to submit questions, so that we can have like the fun chat and then like a questions chat or something. But we could talk about that offline.
Yeah, because I do have to like peel through. You're reading, and it's fun reading it, but it's like to find. By the time you find a question, it's like, yeah, it's a different thing. I get it.
Yeah, it's all right. We did have a question earlier that I do want to talk about. I'm not an expert. Obviously, I can barely speak English apparently today. But the question was, what about early written output? And I think we kind of hit on that. Well, Glitch did at least, saying that maybe that could fossilize, if we even believe that's a thing, grammatical concepts, grammar concepts. Like it wouldn't really do anything for your accent unless you're really sub-vocalizing while writing. But maybe grammar, it might.
I have like a thought on the writing specifically, which I mentioned in the chat earlier. So with writing, so my students, obviously I read their writing a lot at the school. And a phenomenon I noticed, which I also noticed online as well, is if my brain will fill in errors and just correct the sentence as I read. So I need to like purposefully concentrate to notice mistakes in their writing. If they're writing okay enough, my brain will just correct it. And I'll notice like 1 or 2 mistakes, but there could be like 20 or 30 mistakes on a page. And so I think the risk with outputting by typing is that the people who are reading it will just correct it. So I reckon if it's in like let's say a conjugating language like Russian, and you use the wrong conjugation, I think it's likely that they will just read it as the one you meant and things like that. Or in English, we put in the and we put in ah. When people don't use it, we just imagine that they used it anyway.
It's
And we
actually interesting. I've got something relevant to Refold. So I noticed there was an error here in the website where we duplicated a word. And it's amazing how even when you proofread things, right? Because I QA everything
Oh man,
before it goes out, I miss this. So
it is my
your
curse. It
brain
happens every time I
totally
do
does,
anything.
even in your L2, and my Spanish is not that great, it's pretty weak. You miss things, even when you're going word by word. So it's kind of interesting how your brain will
Grammarly
correct things.
not have your back for that.
Grammarly
Or your
does
grammar.
not work in VS Code, which is where these changes are made.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah, I think writing, so output in terms of writing and output in terms of speaking are kind of two different things in the sense of like, because I feel like with speaking, it's more of a muscle memory kind of thing in the sense of like, because you kind of have to shut your brain off in order to keep up with the conversation and kind of engage. You kind of rely on your muscle memory and your instincts a lot more. Where writing, it's more of like you misinterpret something wrong. You know what I mean? Like there's something that's actively wrong with your understanding of how the language works in that moment, kind of thing. So
the whole
I
way
feel like
we
you're
go about
clarifying
them is
different things.
different.
Exactly.
Like
So I feel like
speaking is like your thoughts are just coming out in real time. Whereas writing, you're like,
Yeah.
oh, that was the wrong word, and you go back and you change it, and like,
It's true.
I was having a thought about like early output and like my thoughts on it because like I first studied Russian, started like 8 years ago, and I found Steve Kaufman within like a month. So I immediately
Yeah.
went sort of into like immersion style learning, but I was never afraid of output. And so when I first learned Russian, I was outputting immediately, basically, and throughout the entire process. Never worried about it at all. And I think like I have some interesting thoughts about it. So like for me now, I'm learning Mandarin. The only reason I'm not doing early output that much, I do a little bit, but because my girlfriend speaks Mandarin, but the reason I don't do a whole lot is because it's almost like an experiment to see what difference that has compared to when I did Russian. So with Russian, there's some phonemes that they're not easy for a native English speaker, like the soft L. So like in the name, we would say in English, we say Olia, but in Russian it's Oля, la 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 la. Like it's this really soft L sound that's like not easy for a native speaker to do at all. An English speaker, sorry. And I just spam tried to pronounce that name like hundreds and hundreds of times when I was learning Russian. And eventually I just got the phoneme and like I can just now produce the phoneme. And so I think like early output is only an issue if you're not actively trying to work on it at the same time. So the thing is with my students, right, that are learning English, they're learning English to survive in Australia. They're not learning English because they really love English.
Right.
So I think like with us in Refold, we're learning languages because we love the languages. So I think we're more immune to these mistakes because we're going to be like, oh, I really want to know like the phonology of this language. I want to know the specific grammar, how words are used. I want to know all the different dialects. I want to know the different registers of formality. Whereas like someone who just comes to America and they've just moved over there and they have to learn English and they just want to get a job and live, they don't care about any of that stuff. And so I think we shouldn't emphasize that output is a bad thing because everybody in this community, most like 99% of people in the community really love languages. And so we like look into these issues and we want to correct our mistakes. And so I don't think it's as risky as people think. And we know from like neuroscience studies that the brain is really plastic and it can change in lots of ways. The fact that you can even learn a new accent in your native language shows this. And like you remember like Doge grammar, like when Doge was like a big meme and there was like a grammar for Doge, like that was a thing people could just intuitively pick up and use and make memes. So like
I
it's sort
love
of
it
like
so much.
so it's like we're not limited by like our brain doesn't just come a certain state and get
Queen of
solidified.
England is a good example of this, by the way. She's been recorded in video form for a very long time, and she's been studied. And they have made note of how she has changed her speech over the past, 50, 60, however long years. Just saying it's
Yeah,
out there.
exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I think that is a good point because especially which you bring up glitch where a lot of people that I know, like that I notice that, like for example, that Spanish is a native language and they have a very strong English accent, or like they have very basic, make very basic mistakes in English or whatever. It's generally people who are very like, you know, like, English isn't their funnest thing to do, or is probably not even their second, least funnest thing to
Well,
do.
I can even think of like examples like, let's say my mum casually tries to learn a language every now and then because she thinks the idea of learning a language is really nice, but she doesn't understand the reality of it. And so, like, she might be learning Spanish and she like learns like the word gringo, right? And she doesn't think it's gringo. It's not gringo. It's gringo, And so she
Right.
won't, but she'll be like, oh no, it's okay. Like, she doesn't care. So I'll correct like the phoneme that she's using because it's not a alveol. It's not the R sound of English. It's the trill, the r, right? Like you correct it, or the tap, I guess in this case, right? So you correct it, but some learners, casual learners of languages, they almost don't want you to correct them.
Canadians, Americans, and
Yeah.
Australians, we do have the tap, just as an
Yeah, we have it
allophone.
like in butter, but
Yeah,
people
butter.
still can't. They can't like implement that. They because it's in positions that it doesn't exist in English. Like we don't have the tap after like the G sound in English, like immediately. It's
Yeah.
not like good. We don't really have that.
It's really interesting because you
Yeah.
actually see this sometimes. So like the word zydeco is, if anybody is into like Louisiana music, we spell it with a D in English, but it's actually in French, it's a tapped R from, obviously Louisiana French still has a tap. It doesn't have a uvular rhotic like Metropolitan French. So it's interesting that they borrowed it
That is
and
cool.
they spelled it the way they heard it, which was as a D.
Right.
Hmm.
Zydeco. Wow. Yeah, I think that is interesting. These phonemes are heard as D's in one languages and R's in other languages, and I guess that's why like people learning English, they can't learn the TH sound. They hear it as an S or a T when people say like the or thin, and so it's so difficult for like lots of European speakers.
Also, I want to ask Shiki, when it comes to Japanese, have you noticed, is there like because this might be just a Indo-European centric thing when it comes to writing, it being good for beginners. Is there any added difficulty that for like people that are like learning Japanese or even I guess Chinese, or is it kind of just a default go to, like if you want to start maybe early outputting and you're a little bit nervous, would writing be a good thing to start out with?
Yeah, I think Sin was talking about this earlier in the chat about how it would be easier to get into output through writing first because you have more time to think about what you want to say and there's less pressure.
Mm.
And also
Makes sense.
it's really easy with Japanese because the way the keyboard works, you just start typing in the hiragana and then you'll have like autocorrect choices where you can pick the kanji that you want to use. And it's
So
just
you're basically
converts it.
reading as your type, like you're using your reading as a strong component of your typing,
Yeah.
or like your recognition ability, I guess you would say.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's like I'll start typing the word that I want in hiragana, and then I'll have the kanji suggestions, and I just pick out the one that is correct for what I want to say. So just recognizing the kanji.
That's the most common way of doing it. Believe it or not, there are some adders and refolders who do learn kana input without the transliteration, which is like probably what she's talking about.
Like typing romaji, you mean?
Right.
Yeah,
Some people
yeah.
actually use kana keyboards, which like
Yeah.
to me seems like a pain, I guess, but I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just easier using
People
romaji
prefer
input.
it.
Yeah, because as English speakers, we're already used to where the letters are on the keyboard, and we just, convert that to whatever word it is.
One thing I've always been jealous of with the traditional the traditional Mandarin, traditional character set, people who are used to the Bopomofo input, is that it does require the tone. And I've always felt like had pinyin input required tone to actually even get anywhere near producing the right result, my tones would be a lot better. Atania says, I use Romaji for Russian still. I also use the mnemonic keyboard for typing Russian.
I learned
But
both with Russian, and it really
I quite like the Serbian Cyrillic input, by the way. Very easy. it's almost 1-to-1 to the English keyboard.
That was something that confused me with Russian. Like when I learned it, I first learned the Russian keyboard layout structure, and then I like got keys and put little stickers on my keyboard on my computer so I could write like type letters like the Russian way. And then I updated my computer and I didn't have the stickers anymore. I'm like, I'll just do it the phonetic way, and like it really confused me. So like I don't know. I feel like
They don't
whatever
have like
you yeah.
they don't have like keyboard covers where you can like just lay over, like slap over the, like a
Oh yeah, I
rubber
mean
cover.
they
Got
definitely
stickers.
would, but I just didn't just didn't do it the second
Yeah,
time. But yeah,
yeah.
I
Because
think
my
that's
brother
interesting.
had
You
a
said the tone thing though.
no, okay, yeah. I was just gonna say because my brother had a to learn touch typing, they had put like this thin rubber cover over the keys to like block them, so he couldn't look at them. I'm like, you could just slap a bunch of Cyrillic stickers on that, or get a little Sharpie or something. It might work out for you.
Yeah, well, it's like on my phone, I have the Cyrillic, the Russian sort of layout of the keys, the normal layout that they use. But on my computer, I use it like the phonetic layout, just because I don't have the stickers. And so but I think I got up to the normal speed with the Cyrillic layout on my phone. So I feel like if you wanted to adapt to like, you know, um, Julian with Mandarin or whatever, you probably can do it. It's just it does take like a long time. But yeah, it could be a good idea as with what you said about tones. Like if you have to type tones in, I think that's sort of a really functional point that I've never heard.
So it's part of Bopomofo input, which they use in Taiwan, but Pinyin doesn't require it. There is an
Yeah.
alternative Pinyin input, Terra Pinyin, which has tone optional, but there's no way to make it a hard requirement, which is a little bit unfortunate.
Yeah.
Briz,
Yeah.
we are about at time. Do we want to wrap it up? Maybe mention some stuff?
Yes, I will do my best to remember everything and jump in if I forget something. But thank you so much for joining us for this week's episode of our Refold Roundtable podcast, where we discussed early output. If you would like to suggest our next topic, make sure you do it in the Refold Podcast suggestions chat, where we take the suggestion with the most votes and then we talk about it. I think we're going to be closing suggestions on Wednesday of
Wednesday
this coming
morning
week.
America time. Going forward.
Wednesday morning America time. So make sure you get your suggestions
that way we
in
have
by
like more opportunity to plan,
right,
design the graphics,
right, because we'll
like
promote it, do all that stuff. So submit your suggestions and vote on your favorites. We'd also like to mention that we have a awesome community Patreon that funds events like this, free grammar guides, and everything that you donate to the Patreon goes directly into the Refold community for free resources for all of our awesome refolders here. So make sure you check that out if you haven't already. And I think that's everything. So we will see you next Friday at the same time. George, did I forget anything? Did I get it?
I'll leave the chat open for another 5 minutes. Go crazy, guys. One word to Emmy about America time. Well, I could say Thursday evening Europe time, if that's better for you. Wait, no. I don't know. I don't know Europe time. I've never operated in that time zone. UTC +8, UTC -7 is all I know. I'm sorry, Emmy.
Wednesday morning PDT, PST, Pacific?
PDT, Pacific Daylight Time, I think.
I have no idea. Nobody speaks UTC. Yeah, for real.
But guys,
UTC
shout out
isn't
to the
my target
Patreon.
domain.
The Patreon helps fund these. If we get enough people, one thing that we would like to do moving forward is maybe have somebody whose job is to like actually help project manage all of the cool community things, like the community decks. Like right now, we're working on an English deck for Russian speakers, things like that. So please, if you can, visit the Patreon. Shout out. It still exists. All of it goes 100% back into the community. And I'll see you guys next week.
Bye.